Thank you, Bob. Good evening, everyone. On Thursday, March 23rd, 2006, a series of events unfolded in the Providence Fire Department that would change the way firefighters all over the world operate at structure fires. These events could not have been scripted in a better way or purpose for us to educate firefighters and members of the importance of using SCBAs. I learned the hard way. At 10:31 hours, the Providence Fire Department Dispatch Center received a report of a restaurant fire. It was a converted McDonald's-style restaurant. The first unit reported a smoke condition and a working fire upon his arrival. I was given the task along with the operator of Ladder 1 of forcible entry. We used a K-12 saw to cut the locks on the roll-up doors and steel gates. Our K-12 saw died several times due to the heavy smoke condition on the exterior of the restaurant. Although we were wearing our SCBAs, we did not have our face pieces on while we would be experiencing the heavy smoke conditions outside. The interior fire was knocked down. However, the fire that extended into the roof system was gaining significant headway and was self-venting. After several minutes of an aggressive interior attack, the conditions worsened, and the incident commander ordered an evacuation of all members for exterior operations as a safety precaution. The fire was knocked down and overhaul occurred. Returning to the station, I became increasingly ill, having a severe headache and difficulty breathing. My co-workers actually noticed that I was talking incoherently and wasn't making any sense to the questions that I was being asked. At that point, it was recommended by my officer that I be transported to a hospital for an evaluation. Upon entering the emergency room, a doctor who was familiar with firefighter symptoms and illnesses and who was just passing from one part of the emergency facility to the next noticed me coming into the hospital. He asked me what was wrong. I said that I was at a significant fire and I felt extremely ill and dizzy. He at that point ordered a carbon monoxide and cyanide test be performed on me. I was being treated for CO poisoning while I waited for the results of the cyanide test to come back from the hospital's lab. When the cyanide test result came in sometime later, we had learned that I had a cyanide level of 57 deciliters, micrograms per deciliter, which is 3 times higher than the high safe limit of 20. I was administered sodium thiosulfate, an antidote for cyanide effects. The side effects of this antidote were extremely severe, worse than the actual exposure itself. As it was learned of my exposure to cyanide, the chief of the department was notified that as many as 50 firefighters may have been unknowingly exposed to cyanide. An immediate recall of all the members that were at the restaurant fire was ordered to go to the hospital for cyanide blood tests. While undergoing treatment, a second fire occurred, a 6-unit apartment complex. No significance were reported at this incident. At 0200 hours, a third fire was reported to the Providence Fire Dispatch Center, a 2-story residential occupied structure. At this incident, a fellow firefighter who was the pump operator collapsed on the side of his apparatus. He apparently suffering from a heart attack. He received immediate advanced life support treatment at scene and was transported pulseless to the same hospital that I was receiving treatment at. He was given advanced life support medications in addition to the antidote sodium thiosulfate. This apparently stopped his heart attack from occurring. After recovering, he is now retired and lives with his wife and family. For once, luck was on the side of the firefighters. Fortunately, my department did not experience a line of duty death. In all, 91 firefighters were tested after the 3 fires. More than 50% of those tested had elevated cyanide levels in their blood. You can see that having a standard operating procedure and having rules may just not be enough. If my documented exposure and treatment had not taken place, the outcome to that firefighter may have been gravely different. By my department conducting an extensive investigation, changing standard operating procedures, rules, regulations, and enforcing behavioral change, we may be able to change the mindset of the fire service to use your SCBA. Additionally, a newer antidote has been placed into service. It's called hydroxycobalamin. The side effects are significantly lower than what I had experienced. If we can stop our members from being exposed, then we may stop needless line-of-duty deaths and injuries in the future. We would never enter a hot zone without the proper personal protective equipment. We must consider all fires to be hazardous materials incidents. I would like to introduce at this time a fellow firefighter that has been as passionate as I to spread the word and information started by the Providence Fire Department's investigation on the significance of cyanide exposure. Captain Rick Rockford of the Jacksonville Fire and Rescue Department. I'd like to introduce you to him now. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. And good evening, everybody. Brothers and sisters firefighters, I welcome you to the presentation. My name is Rick Rockford. I'm a captain with the Jacksonville Fire and Rescue. I've been with the department for over 26 years, and my assignment is basically that as a field incident safety officer. For the past 4 years, I've been conducting atmospheric monitoring studies for hydrogen cyanide and carbon monoxide accumulations at various fire applications to show that hydrogen cyanide is present at every fire application that we have. Through this, the products that we see is showing that the combustion creating hydrogen cyanide as well as carbon monoxide have changed the way fires burn for over the past 50 years. During this timeline, plastics and synthetics have replaced ordinary combustible materials within our society, making fires burn 2 to 3 times hotter, creating faster flashovers, and producing much more toxic vapors, thus creating acute as well as chronic health effects related issues to our firefighters both inside and outside the structures. I'm hoping that this presentation will open your eyes to the awareness of the byproducts of combustion and change your lifestyles as far as firefighting tactics. Remember, the information that we learn here today will hopefully save the lives of firefighters tonight. Going into our slides and presentations, one of the questions that we have to bring up is the fact that our American firefighters being poisoned unknowingly during the performances of their fire suppression and rescue duties. Firefighters are actually trained to do their job, and they do the job to the best of their abilities. They focus on the job at hand, but the question is are they actually focusing on their own personal health? And looking at the picture that we see here with the firefighters up on the roof, do we actually know what's coming out of that roof? Do we know the byproducts of combustion, how toxic the materials are? But yet, if we're not wearing our self-contained breathing apparatus properly, we are being exposed to these particular materials. However, the answers that are now being researched, recent findings is suggesting the fact that firefighters may in fact frequently be exposed, sometimes unknowingly, to the dangerous toxicants that of hydrogen cyanide. In looking at hydrogen cyanide as far as producing cyanide materials, hydrogen cyanide is produced by the incomplete combustion of nitrogen as well as carbon-containing substances. Looking at the molecular structure that you see, you're dealing with hydrogen, you're dealing with a triple bonded carbon and nitrogen combined together, creating all of these materials during the combustion phase of our fires, produces high levels of hydrogen cyanide poisoning. Some of these instances that we see on the screen produce even much more toxic materials of hydrogen cyanide versus the others, such as natural fibers such as wool, silk, cotton, paper. Synthetic polymers, which are actually monomer materials that are formed together to make a substance such as nylon and polyurethane materials, very, very prevalent in today's society. Synthetic rubber, as well as melamines, resins for molding, as well as laminating materials. All of these materials that you see depicted in the slide here, and the actual slide as far as the structure fire there, produces large turbulent amounts of smoke. The turbidity of that smoke coming out of that structure is very, very toxic, very, very poison, and who knows exactly what is coming out of this particular structure. In dealing with hydrogen cyanide as far as fire operations, The basic byproducts of combustion breaks down to the hazardous properties into three distinct categories, dealing with particulates, dealing with irritants, as well as asphyxiants and toxicants. And looking at all these materials, we know without a shadow of a doubt that there is a lot of multitudes of various forms of chemicals. And the question you might be asking yourself tonight is that why are we focusing primarily on these two particular types of chemicals? Well, the answer, I should say, is this, is that carbon monoxide basically affects the oxygen carrying capabilities within the actual blood itself. And hydrogen cyanide affects the tissues of organs, mainly focusing on the heart and brain, to where it does not regenerate. In other words, what it does is it is being incapacitated to the point where it's creating scar tissues and it can never really heal itself again. And this is very, very important in our society. In looking at today's hydrogen cyanide releasing polymers, what we see is that in our today's society, building construction contains many synthetic polymers that when they burn create massive amounts of hydrogen cyanide as well as carbon monoxide. And looking at these particular lists of chemicals here, we see insulation is by far one of the most highest levels of producing levels of hydrogen cyanide. In today's times, as far as roll insulation and spray foam insulation that we see in today's homes, these do produce high levels of toxic properties, and when it does catch on fire, what these materials will actually do is they burn 2 to 3 times hotter and faster than ordinary natural building materials, but also too is that it starts quicker flashovers, increases the speed of hydrogen cyanide release materials. These flashover temperatures, as a result of these synthetic polymers, can create temperatures as high as 1,000 degrees up to 1,500 degrees in Fahrenheit. To prove my point, what I'd like to do is I'd like to show a video, and with this video, it produces the toxic gases that are generated by flame propagation. Now, there's a specific term that I would like to bring up to you, and it is basically talking about quantitative decomposition. Now, the question is that you're probably asking, what in the world is quantitative decomposition? Well, this is a period in time when before a fire actually burns, is that there's a time when the gas is emitted without the warning presence of any flames. It's the thermal decomposition, if you will, of the molecular materials inside that environment that starts to break down by radiant heat. It is also the real killer because of the high toxicity and the long duration period of time of this gas being emitted inside that structure before we even have a flame. This dramatized video is produced by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and it depicts a Christmas tree that catches on fire. It's to show why it's always important to make sure that we hydrate our tree so that way it does not get dry and brittle and spontaneously combust from the electrical shorts of the lights. But the main purpose here is to show that as this tree burns, it's creating radiated heat inside that structure. So let's take a look at this video and we'll see exactly what's going on. When this fire starts to take place in this Christmas tree, I want you to focus on the couch, and I want you to focus on the chest of drawers over to the right of it. And then as the fire starts to burn, it's going to start creating radiated heat inside the structure. And as this radiated heat is being disseminated over this larger area, the actual sofa now is starting to produce toxic vapors. It's thermally decomposing for the quantitative decomposition. Above the actual dresser drawers there, you're starting to see where that is starting to produce the vapors itself. And then on the floor itself, you see the carpeting starting off gas, and then the fire is actually starting to incinerate and burn right across the couch as well as the carpeting. And then right across the rest of the room itself, getting the rabbit, as you can see, and then thermally engulfing the whole entire room. As a result of this is very important to go ahead and understand why it's important to know what thermal decomposition is through quantitative decomposition. One of the next major events that have taken place in the United States was the death from toxic mixtures of hydrogen cyanide as well as carbon monoxide at what was known as the Station nightclub in West Warwick, Rhode Island, February 20th, 2003. There was a pyrotechnic device that was instantaneously set off. It was a pyrotechnic gerb that once activated, created an exothermic reaction that generated sparks for 15 feet in 15 seconds. It then set off a substandard sound suppression board foam into a sheet of flames that was wrapped around the stage to utilize to keep the sound into the audience. There was 462 people that were there to listen to the band Great White, and in the process of this, the hydrogen cyanide levels from the activation of the fire itself soared, and people quickly were overcome by the actual smoke in their attempts of getting out of the structure. Unfortunately, there were 100 people that lost their lives, and there were over 200 individuals that were actually severely burned and injured as a result of this event. The medical community at all levels in this particular response did not even recognize the hydrogen cyanide exposures and treated for the modalities of carbon monoxide poisoning, which was no fault of their own because of the fact that this information was not even brought up into this date. Now, to show the recreation, again, by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, this recreation depicts as close as possible what took place at that particular event. The studies revealed that with the absence of a sprinkler system inside this building is that the individual room itself here was non-habitable in less than 90 seconds. Now just imagine 462 people inside this structure trying to get out, and then all of a sudden smoke and flames and the toxic materials incapacitated them, preventing them from getting out of the structure. What we're going to do is we're going to be looking at this video, this recreation, and we're going to be looking through a window, through a video recorder that's 4 feet off the ground. I'm going to be sharing some experiences as far as knowledge on this particular event itself to show you exactly what's taking place and the importance why this material, which is a synthetic material burning, a liquid material going into its natural state, creating the fire, intensifying the fire, and spreading this actual smoke and vapors within the building. So let's show this video clip one time, please. Now, as you're looking at this picture, this is a recreation of the actual stage. There is 2 pyrotechnic degerbs that are actually activated, and these materials are actually setting off the sound suppression board, the substandard board that we see in this video. Now, as the fire starts to burn, you're going to start noticing that the actual material that is burning is creating molten liquid material that's actually dropping to the ground, and it's off-gassing in the process of doing this. As it's starting to off-gas, the vapors from the unburned incomplete combustion of this material is going back up into the fire again, where it's intensifying and fueling the flames. As the fire is intensifying in the upper atmosphere, you're starting to see the accumulation of smoke and the unburned products of combustion that is accumulating in that upper atmosphere. As the fire is intensifying with speed, you're going to start seeing fingers of flames running across the upper atmosphere, where it finds pockets of fresh air to reignite itself and then continuously to burn as quickly and as aggressively as possible. And in the lower section on the left-hand side of that stage, you're going to start seeing where this fire intensively will go there and flash over, traveling across the rest of the foam suppression board, the paneling itself, and therefore the fire intensifying and then the smoke columns building down to the ground. And then all of a sudden, at 1 minute and 30 seconds later, there's complete occlusion of the actual video itself. Now, can this happen in your jurisdiction? You have to ask yourself that question, and I can affirmably tell you absolutely yes. And this is why we need to be aware of these types of situations. Now, let's talk about the health effects in dealing with hydrogen cyanide. The effects of hydrogen cyanide on both patients as well as firefighters. And looking at this slide right here, we have 2 pictures, one on the left side that depicts a victim that is actually removed from the actual structure itself. We're looking at an acute phase of cyanide poisoning. These firefighters basically are working aggressively on this patient to do the best they can to help save this patient's life and transport him to the hospital. Keep in mind is that when an individual is removed from a contaminated environment, their body is a soft tissue, it's a sponge. They're absorbing a lot of this material itself, and when they're brought out into a different environment, their bodies at that point in time is now off-gassing. So therefore, our emergency responders working diligently on this patient is now becoming the recipient of the exposures of the toxic properties of hydrogen cyanide and a multitude of other chemicals for that matter. Next thing you know, when the patient is delivered to the hospital and they clear out and go back to their station again, they'll be complaining about headaches, nausea, vomiting, things of that nature, and maybe because it's the stress of the actual work. But more than likely, it could possibly be as far as the exposures of the contamination. On the right side, we're looking at firefighters that have been inside some form of a fire, and this is on an acute phase where it's constant exposures over and over and over again. These firefighters coming out of the structure are tired, they're weak, they're lethargic. Some of the situations that happened to Lieutenant Toro. And the fact is that we kind of look at the situation and maybe assume that the bear got on their back, they were out of shape, or maybe because of the fact they were having a bad day. But the thing is that we need to be more proactive in our medical diagnosis to go ahead and look as far as what our patients and our firefighters are actually going through, and then go and transfer that information to the medical community when we present the patients itself. Serious as a heart attack, I would very much say and be in total agreement with this, is the fact that as of January 1st of this year till today, June 8th, 2010, the U.S. Fire Administration has reported that there have been 34 firefighters that have lost their lives in the line of duty in various applications of firefighting. As a result of these 34 firefighters, approximately a little over half of these firefighters' cause of death has been contributed to heart attacks and stress and overexertion. What we need to do is we need to be more conclusive as far as the studies, as far as what's going on. There's research that's actually being performed right now to find out whether or not hydrogen cyanide and carbon monoxide has been or could have been a contributing factor into the death of these firefighters that we see each and every year. Also, too, is that looking at hydrogen cyanide specifically, we know that hydrogen cyanide is a cellular asphyxiant. Once we breathe in fresh air, we are actually creating aerobic respirations. We're providing nutrients, we're enzymes so that we can function within our bodies, having normal activities and as such. But once we start inhaling hydrogen cyanide, what this actually does is it has a high affinity for a key enzyme, cytochrome C oxidase, that basically will provide and shut down the aerobic respiratory pathway and actually go and create the anaerobic respirations, resulting in lactic acidosis and other toxic substances that are created in the tissues as well as in the organs. And this is where we find our firefighters coming down with the signs and symptoms of lethargy, respiratory problems, cardiac issues and the such, and also too is that our civilian population that we remove from the structures. Unfortunately, there is no quick test that allows for on-site confirmation of hydrogen cyanide toxicity. However, there are some signs and symptoms that we can look at that could possibly lead to the assumptions in dealing with hydrogen cyanide exposure, and also too is the administration of countermeasure antidotes that can be utilized for the rapid recovery of our patients. Some of the things that we look at as far as signs and symptoms are disorientation, weakness, as well as drowsiness, shortness of breath, also chest tightening, headaches, which is a very, very common occurrence that we see on the fire ground. Also, too, bright red discoloration of skin for individuals that have been prolonged inside of a contaminated environment for a long period of time. The smell of almonds that are on the breath, that is also another classic sign that can be utilized. However, there is only 60% of the population that can physically smell the almond extract. But there again, those that can smell it may not be able to smell this particular odor because of the fact of the other kind of chemicals that may be off-gassing from the body itself. So what we can look at is basically dealing with soot around the mouth and the nose, and basically burns in that area, and also carbonaceous sputum. Let me ask you a question. When you go fight a fire and you do your job and you come back to the fire station, you undress, you take a shower, and you step outside from that shower and you blow your nose, what is being presented in that tissue? You have to ask yourself that question because you too are actually being exposed. Also too is that I like to look into chronic effects that take place as a result of hydrogen cyanide. Some of these can create problems as far as respiratory problems, from depression to respiratory arrest, chest pain, to cardiac arrhythmias, to cardiovascular collapse, eye irritation to vision dimming, palpitations, again, headaches, loss of appetite and extreme weaknesses in the extremities to paralysis. And one important thing that I'd like to take time to go ahead and speak of real quick is the enlargement of thyroid glands. You know, in my department, in Jacksonville Fire Department, we have a very aggressive form of physical. We actually run all of our firefighters through these particular stages, and one thing that we find very important is what is known as ultrasound sonography. And with the ultrasound sonography, we find that what they'll do is actually run these tests that go from the actual neck all the way down to our genital areas, and making sure that our organs are functioning properly, or if there's any type of discrepancies whatsoever. But one of the things that I have noticed that within my department and friends that I have really close with is that I can count on my hand of 10 firefighters that have either had their thyroids removed or basically are being treated for hypothyroidism. Now, why is this important to us as in the fire service, and why is this important to you? Is the fact that early recognition of checking your thyroid and having it taken care of right now can reduce the chances of further complications later on in your life. If your department does not do this type of service, then do me a favor and go to your own personal doctors and make sure that you get a check done. The life that you save at that point in time can very easily be your own. And which brings me to the next slide here, is that the last life that you save should be your own. Everything that you do, as proactive as you are in the fire service, you need to take your own personal life into a special interest. Everything that you do is going to dictate as far as what you do. We lose on an average of 100 firefighters that lose their lives every single year. And if we get more proactive into this type of research and promoting this type of studies to our firefighters, I know without a shadow of a doubt we can reduce those line of duty injuries. Now, historically, in dealing with hydrogen cyanide in fire operations, carbon monoxide asphyxiation has been considered the primary cause of death of those overcome by smoke. And how did we find out this information? It's basically by the use of atmospheric monitoring. Going in with a 4-gas combustible indicator, looking through the smoke and everything, the CO levels on that monitor is going off. Oh well, we've actually found out some of the causes. So therefore, we utilize this as far as our training. We treat all of our medical personnel for the modalities of such. We put in CO detectors within our homes, and we're set and ready to go. However, there's mounting evidence that hydrogen cyanide is now directly responsible for many more deaths previously assumed. And the cumulative effects, the combination of hydrogen cyanide and carbon monoxide together, could be worse than either of them actually are individually gathered. And utilizing of my next slide here, what I want to do is I want to show you a little graph in dealing with carbon monoxide poisoning, which is harmful at various levels, and also hydrogen cyanide poisoning, also too, at various levels. At these small levels, they may go unrecognized and not even known as far as what's going on. However, if we take these two particular substances and join them together, this could have a much extremely higher level of effect, creating some type of toxic effects, as well as possibly leading to death and injury of the firefighters themselves. Also, too, is that in the lethality in dealing with hydrogen cyanide, the toxicity versus the flammability ratio between hydrogen cyanide and carbon monoxide is 35 times greater for hydrogen cyanide exposures. When we look at the chart here on this graph, between the time-weighted averages of what we can be exposed to, we can be exposed up to 4.7 parts per million of hydrogen cyanide, 35 parts per million, but above those two numbers right there, we have to be in certain levels of respiratory protection. Protection for ourselves, protection for our firefighters. At the ideal H range is the life-threatening areas as far as making sure that we can get out of that structure without having any adverse effects. 50 parts per million versus 1,200 parts per million. And last but not least, I want to look at the actual lower explosive levels that look at 5.6 to 40% as far as our LEL is the flammable range. That is a fairly good range for it to burn. But on carbon monoxide, it's 12.5% versus 74%, therefore still showing a higher level of a span. But notice the levels as far as the 5.6 and the 12.5. Friends, let me tell you something. The fires that we're fighting today, we're actually stepping into a can of gasoline if you actually want to look at it. The levels of these lower levels of the ignition factors are dealing basically of a high flammable, combustible synthetic material that burns rapidly and spreads without any problems whatsoever. In order to go ahead and help you in these particular situations, one of the actual atmospheric monitoring instrumentation that I used in my study was the actual Dräger PAC 7000, which is a single-cell electrochemical sensor that is designed to be used at various fire applications. Through this, I used it extensively in structure fires as well as overhaul. Actually, had gone back to investigations to see that there was elevated readings of hydrogen cyanide even after when we had left the actual scene itself. People going into the structures and in not being aware of the actual contamination of the rooms itself. Surprisingly enough, hydrogen cyanide, as far as vehicle fires, what is the main consumption as far as vehicles in today's times? Plastics and synthetics. When these materials burn, producing a high amount of hydrogen cyanide and carbon monoxide and a multitude of other types of gases that are going on there. And also, last but not least, is wildland as well as urban interface. While I was out in the fields and dealing with incident safety, utilizing this monitor, I was getting fairly good readings of hydrogen cyanide because of the fact that wildland fires do produce organic materials, therefore also produces hydrogen cyanide and carbon monoxide and other toxic gases. So respiratory protection is equally needed out there. The dose makes the poison. In looking at this, we see the various arrays of the toxicities as far as light symptoms of exposure to hydrogen cyanide, as well as going all the way up to the lethal ranges. It is very important, and I emphasize again, the use of atmospheric monitoring. Always utilize that monitoring because the evasive tests that I have done have been elevated to where kilometric testings have shown that I've been well above the 200 parts per million of hydrogen cyanide in a relatively normal structure fire. So every fire that we're going into, these levels are extremely level. So the question is, how can we prevent this from happening? What can we do to go and protect and prevent hydrogen cyanide exposure? Well, some of the things that we're looking at here is basically dealing with compliance. There needs to be an enhanced compliance with existing mandatory mask regulations. What I'd like to say is this, is that with this enhanced compliance, it will require a cultural change on the part of the firefighters. In looking at this, I'd like to address this moment to my incident commanders that are sitting out there listening to what I have to say. Sirs, I know that you have a very, very important job to do. You have an ultimate responsibility for the health and welfare for everybody that's working on the site itself and making sure that they do the job safe and they get the job accomplished. And I do appreciate that, and I do encourage you to keep up the good work that you're doing. However, what I need you to do is I need you to make sure that our company officers as well as our firefighters are doing their job to the best of their ability. Meaning that company officers inside the structure, they are doing the job to go and make sure that the fire is knocked down, overhaul is taking place and all. The incident commander cannot see exactly what's going on. However, as a result of this, the company officer needs to lead by a positive and aggressive example. Meaning that when he's inside that structure, he too needs to be wearing his respiratory protection because his subordinates under him are going to be looking up to him as far as what they do. If that company officer is not wearing his mask, those subordinate personnel are not going to do the same. And therefore, when these subordinate personnel actually become company officers later on in time, what kind of habits are they going to instill? As a recommendation, I always go in there and utilize this theory is that be aware to use your air. Wear it all the time. Also, too, is the fact that when we look at other forms of training, we need to make sure that we comply with the explanations as far as why cyanide is more significant today than ever before. We need to actually sit down with our fire department personnel, and we need to go over an identification of cyanide-containing fuels. Also, the medical complications and the concerns of dealing with hydrogen cyanide. Why firefighters can no longer rely on their past experiences to determine whether or not a particular atmosphere is safe. basically is utilizing this monitor. You cannot do this anymore, folks. What we need to do is we need to deploy all of our cyanide detection equipment in the field and use it at all fires. The question I would ask you at this point in time is that those departments that utilize atmospheric monitoring, the question is that do you actually keep it on the hazmat unit? And if you say yes, my question to you at this point in time is, does that hazmat unit respond on all fires? And if you say no, you're basically shorting the lives of your firefighters. That instrumentation needs to be on the first arriving engine company that is showing up on scene. That needs to be utilized to let those firefighters know exactly what they have in store for them or what is actually taking place. We also need to be concerned about post-fire decontamination. We need to make sure that our firefighters, they shower and change their clothes soon after they finish the response. And also, too, is to make sure that they wash their turnout gear on a frequent basis. Some departments, they will have structured scheduled times where they actually have their gear washed, and then during those times between those structures that they wash it on their own. That's the best way of doing it, because of those molecules, the carbon that's building up on those materials itself is also going to go ahead and lead to further complications to you later on down the road. If you also have a department that issues a second set of gear, that's great. It's always best to go in there and rotate your gear around. There's also another rule is dealing with the NFPA requirement. It's called the SCBA Rule of Air Management. And what this is the NFPA 1404 Respiratory Standards for 2007. It's only been out for just a few years. I don't know if many people really know about this. But the Rule of Air Management, commonly known as the ROAM, is to go in there and talk about as far as know exactly how much air you have in your bottle. When you go to work to the fire station every day, or you're going to report for duty, period, is that the first thing that you do is you check your air supply and make sure that you have a full amount of air. When you do deploy that respiratory protection and you use it at an incident, take the time before you go into that contaminated air to see exactly how much air that you have on your regulator gauge. Manage it as you go, meaning that as you are inside that structure, look at that, take the time to see exactly how much. Because if you're deep inside of a building and you utilize half a tank of air, it's going to take you at least that much to get out of that structure before you run into problems. But also, too, is that you want to leave that IDLH environment before, and I highlight before, your low-level alarm activates. To make it simple, I utilize a theory that I teach firefighters, and I think it's pretty self-explanatory. But when you take a bottle, an SCBA bottle, 4,500 PSI, what we look at is 4,500 PSI down to the 1,100 PSI mark for the activation of our low-level alarm system. That belongs to the department in which you work for. From that 1,100 PSI down to 0 belongs to your family that's sitting at home. For all of the actions that you take while that bell is going off inside the structure is taking time away from the family that you have who loves you so very, very much. And for those actions that you take inside there is going to jeopardize whether or not they're going to have a loved one come home to them, or whether or not they're going to have to worry about taking care of you for the rest of their lives. So I would actually ask that you do me one favor. Watch your air. Make sure that you use it wisely and get out before that bell goes off, because you have people at home that love you and they miss you. Do not let this be you. So in conclusion, there's 3 points that I want to go and get across with you so that hopefully you take with you at the end of this program. Number 1 is that where does hydrogen cyanide come from? Number 1, it is basically a byproduct of combustion that we see at virtually every fire. It also comes from plastics and synthetic polymers that when they do break down through thermal decomposition, they go back down to the normal state, which are monomers or chemicals that actually form this together. Also, too, is that keep in mind that when these materials burn, they burn 2 to 3 times hotter and faster, quickening the release of flashovers, as well as also creating much more toxic vapors at the site itself. Also, too, is that how does hydrogen cyanide affect you? Some of the things that we look at, this is just some of the basics, is basically disorientation, weakness, lethargy, okay? What we look at is that the breakdown of plastics and synthetic polymers. And also keep in mind that these materials will burn 2 to 3 times faster and hotter. How can we protect ourselves? Again, keep in mind one thing. Be aware, folks. Use your air. Use it all the time. It's the most important tool that you have on that apparatus. Atmospheric monitoring, gas detection is by far some of the most important instrumentations that you can use to help you in your determination whether or not a scene is actually contaminated or not. Also, too, is through post-fire decontamination. Make sure that you wash your gear on a regular basis, and that also includes your Nomex hoods. Those Nomex hoods are the closest part of the material from fires that you actually go through that is actually next to your skin, and dermal absorption is actually bringing this stuff in. And also, too, is that keep in mind is that we need to provide department-wide education as to the awareness of carbon monoxide and hydrogen cyanide exposures. In closing, what I'd like to do is I'd like to go and say 3 specific things to you, my firefighting brothers and sisters. Is that number 1 is I appreciate you listening to this presentation. I hope that you got some information. I hope that you take this with you and you enjoy this information and share it with all your brother and sister firefighters. But one of the several things that I want to go ahead and bring up is this. Is number 1 is that do your job safely. Make sure that when you go to that fire station to go to the work, either as a career firefighter, paid on call, volunteer, whatever the case may be, do it safely. There are people sitting waiting for you to come home. When you return to your families, enjoy your family time with them. They love you, they respect you, they want you there. And also, too, is that for all of the years that you put into the fire service, I want you to be able to enjoy, and I mean enjoy, your retirement life as a healthy, career, retired firefighter. Thank you very much.
Okay, we just have a couple quick questions from the audience that we've just got coming in here. Again, we're going to try and answer all the questions. If we're unable to answer your questions here tonight, we will make sure that we email you the answers after the webinar is over. The first one comes in. I believe this one's for whoever would like to answer this one. Can the smoke color be an indicator of high levels of toxins?
Absolutely so. The different levels of smoke is going to go ahead and tell you as far as the turbidity, as far as what is burning inside that structure. And keep in mind, like I had mentioned, is that through fire, and a majority of the components that we have in our homes today is dealing with synthetics and plastics and polymer materials. And as these materials burn, the intensity of the fire is generating a lot of heat, various colors of smoke, creating turbidity, and also, too, creating higher levels of flashover conditions.
This one actually goes to Anthony, Lieutenant Toro. Is the Providence Fire Department EMS or any department in Rhode Island carrying the antidote kit? If yes, are they carrying the old cyanide kit or the cyano kit?
They currently have the cyano kit, which is very shortly going to be expiring, and another member of our department is working on a program to get the hydroxycobalamin kit for every apparatus, at least for the rescues currently, but then for all apparatus.
Okay, got another one here. What is the half-life of HCN once it's into the bloodstream? The reason I am asking this is to determine what time frame is essential at a minimum to receive the antidote, sodium thiosulfate.
Each person is different, the half-life per se, but in order to receive the antidote, each person or each patient must be experiencing the symptoms described in our presentations. If you're not experiencing the symptoms, you will not be afforded the antidote. So it can take many hours or even days for it to leave your bloodstream. In our case, the firefighter that had a heart attack, his level was 77. My cyanide level was 57. We will never know when my heart attack would have occurred. Maybe it would have occurred at 59 or 104. There's no way to know. His occurred at 77. Mine, we didn't get there yet.
Again, this one's also for you, Lieutenant. Where do I find, or who do I need to talk to in Providence to get a copy of the SOG regarding HCN and rehab?
He can contact me at our local799.com, and I will make a copy and send it out through department mail.
I guess this is another one here. What would be the best guideline? Hang on. Well, I'm sorry, here we go. What would be the best guideline on monitoring levels of CO and HCN to DOF and SCBA?
As experience has shown me, there are certain parameters that that EPA has come up with as far as 35 parts per million for carbon monoxide poisoning. They're looking at basically some departments are bringing it down to 25 parts per million. EPA is looking now to go ahead and reduce it down to 9 parts per million. But you know, those particular concentrations are one-time exposures. In the life of a firefighter, we don't go just one fire. We go to a combination of fires through our career. And those combination of exposures like that is going to go in there and exacerbate these particular concentrations over a period of time. It's my recommendation is that as long as you're wearing your air and being observing of the fact that you are utilizing the self-contained breathing apparatus, keep that on for the duration that you're inside that structure. The better off that you are with self-contained breathing apparatus as far as the particulates, the vapors, the toxicants that are inside there, even at small, minute levels, can have devastating effects either right then or later on down the time. We're seeing firefighters that when they go to a fire and when they come back from the fire, either having a heart attack or some type of debilitating event as soon as they get back to the fire stations or basically when they get home. And it's because of the continuous exposures of these toxic materials. That self-contained breathing apparatus that's on your back is your lifeline. My recommendation is to wear it until you're fully away from the building at all times, and then make sure that if you do go into those structures, that you bring in your monitors and special equipment to work in that range.
It also should be noted that in the fire service, there's a cumulative effect of exposures to enhance what the captain said. You can go to several fires and not have any symptoms whatsoever, and then on the 4th or 5th fire or incident have a minimal exposure and have all the cumulative effects that previously occurred create a devastating incident for you at that one time, even though the previous incidents were very minor.
Okay, we got another question over here. What gases are mandatory to measure at any structure fire?
What gases
are mandatory to measure?
Well, we look at the 4 gases which we're doing with our O2, our LEL for our lower explosive levels, our oxygen and hydrogen sulfide. However, there's a multitude of gases that we see. Many departments right now are taking hydrogen sulfide sensors out of their monitors and are replacing them with hydrogen cyanide. So that way they get the benefits of both worlds as far as detecting for hydrogen cyanide and carbon monoxide. The thing is that it all depends as far as the capabilities of your department and your atmospheric monitors. Whatever monitors that you have, at least if you see something that's taking place, you're going to get some type of an indication that there's something there. Whether it's your O2 content that's going down, it's letting you know that there's some type of exclusion of oxygen that's taking place that's masking the actual environment itself. So therefore, you need to be aware of actually what's going on.
I got another question here. After an exposure, what time frame exists for symptoms of HCN poisoning to appear? Hours, days, weeks?
Hydrogen cyanide poisoning can stay within the body for up to 8 days. Now, again, depending upon the type of person, depending upon his physical attributes and things of that nature, it may affect him right then, or it could happen later on down the road. And some of the numbers that I just told you as far as the firefighters that have lost their lives from heart attacks, what we see is that those particular numbers of heart attacks are individuals from the age of 50 years of age on up. And this is basically continuing exposures to those types of toxic materials. So again, it all depends on the individual. It all depends as far as his physical abilities, the type of work that he does, his lack of respiratory protection or his lack of education thereof as far as not cleaning his proper levels of protection. All of these types of situations can lead up to exacerbating situations later on in their particular lives.
This is another question for you. Can you use a filter to prevent breathing in the HCN CO, or do you need to have supplied air? I guess it's more for fire investigations.
There is no, to my knowledge, there is no filtering mechanisms that will actually go in there and protect as far as hydrogen cyanide. However, arson investigations or investigations period need to utilize a full self-contained breathing apparatus, not only for the toxic vapors that may be inside, but also for the particulates that are actually accumulating into those particular structures.
Rick or Anthony, what would you guys recommend for protection in wildland fire?
That is also another good question that is actually being discussed right now through the forestry system itself, because right now there is, to my knowledge, no form of protection for our forestry workers as well as our firefighters on scene. The best protection that we have right now is to limiting your responses into the fire areas, staying out of those areas as much as possible, being upwind, uphill, and if need be, if you have to physically go inside there, is to utilize some form of self-contained breathing apparatus that you can go in there and protect yourself and just hope for the best right now.
Two of the, what should be noted is that at least 2 of the 34 firefighters that have perished this year so far, 2 of them are in their mid-40s, and they were classified as having heart attacks. It's interesting to see that they classified that as a heart attack, or was it an exposure, an acute exposure to a high level of cyanide? Well, we don't know, because the post-mortem examination won't reveal it, because by the time that occurs, the off-gassing of the cyanide has left the body or the bloodstream. Thank you.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time tonight and your insights into this serious, serious topic affecting all firefighters. At this time, we'd like to present you a small gift of our appreciation. I'd like to present you both with a personalized version of an XAM 5000 multi-gas monitor. Of course, it's including both an HCN and a CO sensor inside there. So we hope that you get to use this in your continuing education and work to train firefighters both today and in the future.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
We'd also like to thank all of you for attending, from our local audience here in Pittsburgh to the people that signed up in 9 other countries. We also want to let you know that you can get archives of this webinar by visiting our website at www.dräger.com. You can also get future webinars on future topics for firefighters, as well as find solutions for protecting and detecting dangers of HCN/CO, including SCBAs, thermal imaging cameras, detector tubes, filter masking cartridges, fire escape hoods, and a host of gas detection solutions. Thank you again for coming, and good night.